Where will Davante Adams land? We'll tell you on this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Welcome back. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. And it's a Wednesday show. So, of course, Matt Williamson is here back from the NFL Combine in Indianapolis. Matt, did you enjoy your trip?
I had a blast. It's always one of my favorite weeks of the year. Three of us drive there. The Steelers take care of us. We're at their booth the whole time. Things are buzzing like crazy. But I always make the joke that while I'm at the Combine, I miss the Combine, because I don't get to watch any drills. I do 5 hours of radio a day, and then I get with Peacock and other people in the evenings, so I really don't see any of the drills. So I come home and basically spend the whole weekend, this past weekend, or I guess it was 2 weekends ago now, just watching NFL Network like crazy, trying to keep up on the drill work and all that kind of stuff. But it's kind of like watching a show when you know the ending, wonder what Golden's going to run on this 40. You still watch it, but he's going to blaze. So that's kind of odd. I would say it was a little bit less buzzy of a Combine than usual, though. And maybe I don't have a great answer for that. Maybe just because the quarterback class isn't as strong, or the top of the draft overall just isn't as strong. Like, I'm not super impressed with Mason Graham if he's the 5th best player in this entire draft. That's not a knock on him, but most years he'd be the 12th best player in the draft,
Do you also think it has to do with something? There's more credentialed media than ever at the Combine.
Yes.
And it seems like there's a lot of younger
bloggers and TikTokers.
You know what I'm trying to say.
I'm allowed to be old and say that.
Yeah, you could be
right.
Get off my lawn guy. Do you think that's partly why maybe we weren't hearing as much chatter? Is there's more ears listening around?
It's a great point, because it's very, very true. Like,
less ears to be trusted specifically.
But that's for sure. And people hovering around the bars, because there's some spots that you just know people are going to be at, that I'm sure those bloggers and TikTokers, et cetera, are there. But even like the media room is this huge ballroom. And basically any time in my life, I could go up there, get a coffee, get a water, get a juice, get a soda. And then, the meals, they come out and there's plenty. You could take some for everybody down at the radio table. Now you go up there and they're just like gone. I mean, there's just so many people there credentialed, which is kind of terrible, Yeah.
All right. One of the things I do want to ask you about, we heard some buzz throughout Indianapolis that Davante Adams is going to be on the move. The Jets made that official on Tuesday. They released him. You look at this wide receiver market in free agency, and then you look at the draft. It's not a particularly strong draft for receivers. I still like Davante a little bit. I thought he was pretty good, even with the disaster of a quarterback situation that the Jets had. Where do you think he ends up landing in free agency, and how much fantasy value does he have left, even if it's just for 1 year?
I think he has plenty of fantasy value. I think that he's now in a position he can handpick where he goes. I hope he realizes that following Carr or Rodgers, be your own man, go pick somewhere else. But I do think being his own man is going to end him up on the West Coast. I keep hearing both LA teams heavily, especially once Kupp leaves, both of whom I would be fine with if I was a dynasty Davante owner. That kind of rhymes.
Kate, what do you think? Where do you think Davante lands?
It does seem like most of the buzz is going to lead him to the West Coast. Now, as a Steelers fan, do I wish they were talking about the West Coast of Pennsylvania? Sure, I do. But I think, the
West Coast of the Monongahela River? Yeah.
Yes. Like, come on, let's be creative. They said West Coast. They weren't specific. Like, come on, let's be a little bit more specific here. I actually think that the Rams are probably my favorite landing spot for Davante Adams. And here's why. So I did some digging, and I was trying to figure out, okay, the Steelers obviously in a big need for a wide receiver, right? So I wrote an article for Behind the Steel Curtain, just looking at what he accomplished with the Raiders versus the Jets versus his career average. And what I thought was really interesting, Davante Adams actually played a ton of snaps out of the slot last year. A career high percentage of his snaps came from the slot. Obviously, Cooper Kupp departing the Rams, that'll create a huge need for them out of the slot. But what we actually saw is a big uptick in efficiency with the Jets when he was playing a greater percentage of those snaps out wide. Saw a monstrous bump from 1.66 yards per route run with the Raiders to 2.16 yards per route run with the Jets over an 11-game span. 12.8 yards per reception. That's actually above his career average. 6.3 yards after the catch per reception. Again, after, far above his career average. And I think a lot of that was them getting this high percentage, kind of looks to Davante Adams and just saying, like, here's the ball, go be Davante Adams. And I think that's a really great workaround for a aging 32-year-old wide receiver to just, reliable hands. I'm going to get you this ball and just see what you do with it. And I think that the Rams can do a really good job of orchestrating touches for a player like Davante Adams.
Real quick, I mean, I think it was an afterthought, but down the stretch, Rodgers and Adams both played pretty well.
They got hot.
Yeah. Nobody noticed, but they were pretty good together. Right.
It took a minute. And I think that's fair because they hadn't played together for, a minute, and they came in mid-season. Like, I have a feeling if we saw Davante Adams heading to the Jets earlier in the season, we might have just a generally different view of Davante Adams. But you look at those, final 6 games, right? Like touchdown, 2 touchdowns, touchdown, like 200-yard games in that span. We did see some production, and that's with Davante Adams sharing a football field with Garrett Wilson.
Matt, you mentioned the 2 LA teams. I want to give you another team, another California team. What about the 49ers? And we're going to talk about Deebo Samuel here in a little bit, but they've already traded Deebo. There's been lots of rumors. Actually, I think it was even John Lynch that said that, they're open to trading Brandon Ayuk, right? I've got some doubts that they're really going to rely on Ricky Pearsall and Jaywan Jennings to be their top receivers. Do you think Davante Adams to the 49ers would make some sense if Adams is trying to go play in California, play on a winning team?
Certainly if Ayuk is truly on the move, which I don't know that I believe. I mean, it doesn't make a whole lot of financial sense, but who knows? I mean, I do think
unless they're just tired of him.
Maybe he might be a pain about it. Right.
I was reading a couple of reports at The Athletic where there was just a lot of tension over that deal, and I think some people in the front office just want to wipe their hands of the Ayuk situation, knowing they're going to take a big loss on it.
Then why make the deal in the first place?
Yeah, right.
That's what I don't. That's what I don't get is why make the deal in the first place. It's not like there was an old regime that made the deal last season. They wiped house. Like, what changed? I still don't really get what changed, and that's what doesn't make sense for me, because it's not like.
I do have to remember that I am talking to 2 very bitter Steeler fans that didn't land Ayuk last year. So I got to remember that when we're having this conversation.
No, honestly.
Trading a guy the year after you sign him, though.
It is weird, but
signing bonus.
Well, if it wasn't being considered, I don't think it would be mentioned. But again, let's assume that he is traded. And there's a couple of rumors that maybe the Patriots would be interested.
Sure.
Then does Adams make sense for San Fran?
A lot. I mean, as their chain mover, X-receiver, man coverage beater. I don't think Shanahan loved that Ayuk was the man guy, Deebo was the zone guy, I mean, because it makes you a little too predictable. It handcuffs you as a play caller a little too much. So, yeah, I would think there'd be interest. I almost feel like Ayuk would have to move, though. I know we're kind of up against it in this segment, though, but a big thing Ryan and I always talked about, though, is don't forget this is Dynasty. He did finish the season strong. I'd love him to be a Steeler. I'm definitely starting him in week 1 if he's on my fantasy team. No doubt, no matter where he lands. But if he ends up with the Rams or Niners in particular, or even the Chargers, is that what you sell? Because it's probably his peak in terms of just dynasty value.
I don't think there's very many situations where he could land and he's going to be like the bona fide number one passing option in that attack, right? I think whoever signs him is going to be trying to bring him into the current core they have. And I think you're right. I think that's when you sell when the hype is the highest.
Yeah.
But Matt,
I don't think he's I don't think he's a top 5 NFL receiver anymore.
No.
I think he's great and really, really good, but I don't know that I don't think he'll ever be that guy again.
No. All right, let's talk about the Deebo Samuel trade. Let's talk about who stands to gain the most value, who is hurt the most by this trade. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by Chewy. You've probably heard of Chewy before. They really do have everything you need to keep your pet happy and healthy. Whether you're shopping for food, treats, or even pet healthcare, Chewy makes it fast, easy, and affordable. With over 100,000 products from all of your favorite brands, Chewy has everything your pet needs, from food to treats to toys, bedding, and grooming. And it's not just for dogs. They've got supplies for birds, fish, reptiles, cats, small pets too. Chewy also makes it easy to manage your pet's health with prescriptions, telehealth vet visits, and even in-person vet clinics rolling out nationwide. And auto ship is a game changer. You can automatically deliver have your stuff delivered to your house, your food, your treats, or any of your essentials. So when you run out, it'll be there on time, and you can easily change it at any time or cancel whenever you need to. Chewy has everything you need to keep your pet happy and healthy. Right now, you can save $20 on your first order and get free shipping by going to chewy.com or by clicking the link in the description. Save $20 on your first order with free shipping by clicking the link in the description. Minimum purchase required. New customers only. Terms and conditions apply. See site for complete details. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Matt, one of the things that happened when you were at the Combine is that Deebo Samuel got traded from the Niners to the Commanders. Let's start with the Deebo piece of this. Do you think this helps, hurts, or doesn't really change his dynasty value?
Slight bump. You know, I mean, I love that a team loves you. You know, I mean, somebody went out of their way to add you. That's a smart offensive mind. It's an up-and-coming franchise. I think there's just value in that, you know, that somebody loves you out there. You know what I mean? So I think that's important. I'm also, maybe this is more of an NFL than fantasy take, though. I'm super enamored with what they can do with him in motion and getting him the ball in a variety of ways, matched with Jaden Daniels' legs. You know, I mean, I just think that there's a lot of options there. They're going to be hard to defend for opposing defenses. But I don't know that he's skyrocketing or anything. I mean, it's pretty level. I mean, it's kind of a plateau, but a slight bump to me.
Kate, I want to ask you, do you think this hurts Terry McLaurin's dynasty value at all, or is this not really? Yeah, not a needle.
Non-factor for me. I just think in general, just such different players. And I do think that, as Matt mentioned, I think they're going to play very different roles here in the offense. I think, you know, get Deebo in motion. I think, you know, there's also the motivation factor. I think Deebo's heard a lot of chatter this offseason. If he's going to be motivated by that chatter, time will tell. But I do think in general, we're going to see, you know, a very different type of usage. I think, you know, Terry McLaurin still going to be like that outside guy, play more of that traditional, you know, wide receiver one role. Whereas Deebo, I think they're probably going to use him more as a creative guy. But what I will say that I think could be something worth paying attention to, or something worth wondering or postulating as we're heading into 2025, is whether or not he's going to be returning kicks here with the Commanders. Because I think that didn't do him any favors. Returned 17 kickoffs, 533 yards last year, did have a career high 31.4 yards per return. Good stuff, great, what have you. But man, when you're returning kicks and you're returning them fairly well, which I thought he did fairly well in the return game last year, that gasses you for, you know, some of the plays in between, especially, you know, considering there were a lot of, you know, breakaway plays here called back by penalty. I just don't think it was the best usage of Deebo Samuel, especially when he's not at his fittest. to designate him for some of those plays that, yeah, he might be good at it, but when penalties are thrown at the rate that they are on kick and punt returns, is it worth it? Probably not. And I think that did sacrifice some of his efficiency on the football field.
I think that's a great take. Sorry, I'm going to throw one thing at you guys, though. So if it didn't hurt his stock, and I know they drafted McCaffrey last year, who frankly to me is not a needle mover, but it was not a throwaway pick either.
No.
What if they use a second-round pick on a receiver? Because all of a sudden they're kind of old with their top two. Could his stock drop in our eyes the day after day 2 of the draft?
Well, not only the old at the top two, but they've got Austin Eckler, who's 30 now, and they're relying on Zach Ertz, who is in his 30. Like they're just
Denami Brown probably won't be back, and he's okay, right? And
it does make sense that this could be a draft where they want to add, a talent. They did draft Ben Sinnott in the second round last year. I think I'm with you, Matt. Like I think Deebo is going to have some value because Cliff Kingsbury's offense throws so many doggone screens and bubble screens and quick slants that maybe we just see him get more receptions than we have in the last couple of years with San Fran. But this isn't somebody like I'm actively trying to go out and trade for or anything like that in my dynasty leagues.
No, I think it's fine. But once again, when there's buzz around a player, it's a little easier to move them.
Yeah.
Maybe you can get a little more,
Kate, I want to ask you about San Fran because we talked about Ayuk. He's coming off a major knee injury, not just an ACL. I think there was also a PCL injury as well there. They have Ricky Pearsall. They have Jennings. McCaffrey's coming back from an injury. Who do you think gains the most value in San Fran with this Deebo news?
Not necessarily because of the role Deebo Samuel plays, but I think a culmination of factors. You mentioned the devastating knee injury for Ayuk, the potential trade buzz. I don't know how much of that is there because, looking at Brandon Ayuk's contract, they don't save any money this year. They're not going to really gain much of anything. Post June 1 trade, they can move on, save $6 million this year, but he's still got a ton of dead money on the back end. I don't know. I think that Juwan Jennings is the best option in this group. I think he's the most talented receiver. I think he does a little bit of everything that the 49ers like. They love his ability as a blocker. And I just think when you look back at the 2024 season, he answered a lot of questions about his ability as a receiver. They got him under a contract extension. And I think I just think like behind Brandon Ayuk, he's probably the most talented wide receiver on that team. And if there's going to be vacated targets, I'd like to see some of them go to Juwan Jennings.
Matt, what do you think?
I'm sure Shanahan is greedy with this and wants one more, which I totally get. And their window isn't going to be open forever, and they're trying to win the Super Bowl. But it isn't Jennings, Pearsall, Ayuk, Kittle, McCaffrey, and maybe mid-round receiver or running back enough weaponry to win with? It's not bad. McCaffrey.
It's not bad. No, you're right. It's not bad.
Fragile. It's fragile.
That's the thing is I think it's fragile. And that's where I'm a spoiler. I have a mock draft coming out of the 33rd team later today, where at pick number 11, I have San Francisco drafting a receiver because it just wouldn't surprise me at all if they are like, hey, we're in this window right now. Let's grab a receiver and let's load up again. That won't shock me at all, Matt. So I'm kind of the mindset like, I don't think this drastically changes anybody's dynasty value in San Fran. I just think we're kind of in wait and see mode until things get fleshed out a little bit.
I bet Pearsall's stock is going up, though, right or wrong, in the dynasty community.
Yeah, probably, right? Well, and it's also
ADP natural. At least.
Yeah, and this is what happens generally for like second year, first round receivers. There's always this natural bump up the following year. But he's not somebody out of the way. But he's not somebody I'm going out and trying to get in my leagues either. Like, no. I'm okay. If I miss on him, I'm okay.
The same thing I just said about Deebo and Adams. It might be the time to sell them. Everyone thinks, Pearsall's ready to explode. I didn't love him that much.
Kate, any final thoughts on the 49ers before we move on?
I think this is a great time to move on from Ricky Pearsall. Again, I'm not trying to like pile on to the kid, but I don't think we saw enough, in terms of his rookie season to believe that we're going to see a monstrous step up. And, maybe trading Deebo Samuel is a small vote of confidence for Ricky Pearsall. I think it's more just like get what we can for Deebo while he's still got some trade value.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the more likely scenario than it is a vote for Ricky Pearsall in particular. But I just, that's where I'm at with the 49ers. I think probably all these wide receivers that we're talking about right now could be an interesting opportunity to sell, but I don't know.
All right, let's talk about some quarterbacks because there are two really interesting quarterback options as we get closer to free agency. Sam Darnold and Justin Fields. Let's talk about their dynasty values next. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen, check out the new Locked On NFL Draft Show with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Now that the season is over, get the latest draft rankings, rumors, and news every day. Find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. All right, Matt, I want to ask you about a couple free agent quarterbacks. It's a pretty rough quarterback group. We're staying away from Aaron Rodgers and Russell Wilson because you don't want those guys in your dynasty league. But the two quarterbacks that you might be interested in are Sam Darnold and Justin Fields. We're just a few days out from free agency. Where do you think Sam Darnold lands, and how do you think that impacts his dynasty value?
My hunch, if I were to put a chip down on both these two where they're going to land, and I have really no insider information, and nobody told me at the combine, and hey, I was down at the Steelers facility yesterday, and nobody said, hey, Matt, what's your take on Fields versus Wilson? I mean, believe it or not. But I do think if I were to bet, I would say Darnold to the Raiders, Fields to the Steelers. And I think the Steelers make their move before free agency opens. I mean, both the Omar Khan at the combine and Mr. Rooney with his final goodbye for the season thing said, we'd really like to have a quarterback before free agency opens because we know they need a receiver. But what type of receiver? It's a lot different if it's Wilson versus Fields. So I think it's going to be Fields to the Steelers, Darnold to the Raiders, and then maybe they go Genty, in Vegas, and all of a sudden that's a pretty good offense.
Let's start with Darnold because I do think he's probably going to get the bigger of the two contracts here.
He should.
Although I was listening to Peter Schrager this morning, and he was talking about how maybe the market's dried up a little bit for Sam Darnold. But if he goes to the Raiders, what kind of dynasty value do you think he could have with Pete Carroll, Chip Kelly, Brock Bowers, and the rest of their weapons?
Quarterback 16? That sound fair? I don't think he's in my top 12.
So like quarterback 16, that's like what? 8 spots ahead of Trevor Lawrence right now in Dynasty League football?
I'd rather have Lawrence, but he's also one of my favorite buy lows. Right? Yeah,
like,
I hear you.
We're all on Trevor Lawrence at QB 23, QB 24. But I agree with you. Like, I think that's probably where you would have. Kate, what about you? Where would you have Darnold if he lands with the Raiders?
I think somewhere around there feels fair. Now, my biggest concern comes from, is he going to turn back, or is the carriage going to turn back into a pumpkin when the clock strikes midnight and he doesn't have Kevin O'Connell here orchestrating that offense? Now, obviously, you've got Chip Kelly. I think there's plenty of weapons there for the Las Vegas Raiders. Like, I think it's an intriguing situation, but I don't think it's going to be as favorable as it was with the Minnesota Vikings, period. I just don't. So I do think he loses some value there. And based on the end of season trajectory that we saw Darnold on, I think we saw him, flashback, seeing ghosts a little bit. Like there was some uncomfortable play from Sam Darnold to close out the season. I think in general, I'm less of a Sam Darnold believer, but I can't tell if it's because I have take lock and I'm just not convinced of Sam Darnold being the real deal, or am I properly assessing the situation? Maybe it's a little bit of both, somewhere in the middle.
I've got some mixed feelings as well, but I do think the Raiders are a decent landing spot because I think Pete Carroll does a pretty good job of getting these quarterbacks to play well in his system. Now, maybe it's not the best for fantasy purposes. I think Russell Wilson and Geno Smith both could have had bigger performances with more wide open offenses, but I don't think that's an awful landing spot from an NFL perspective. But in general.
And real quick, Marcus,
Yeah.
if he would land there, it's almost like a vote that to me, it's almost like I'll bet on Brady and Kelly and Carroll.
Yeah.
The people that made the decision, they seem pretty smart. If they pick Darnold, then I'll roll with that.
All right, let's talk about Justin Fields. I might as well just dip out of this whole segment and let you two Steeler guys talk about Justin Fields. But Matt, if Fields were to re-sign with the Steelers, it would be one of the few times in NFL history where a quarterback got benched and then got a long-term deal the next offseason, which would be kind of funny.
Well, he was never the starter.
I'm just joking. Just relax.
Okay.
All right. Let's say Fields gets a 2-year deal with some guarantees in there.
Yeah.
Where are we putting Justin Fields in terms of our dynasty rankings? Because we know that his legs are a cheat code. I've got to assume it's fairly high, right?
Ahead of Darnold.
Yeah.
I mean, because they're not going to draft one in round 1. Maybe they'll draft Milroe in the 3rd round or something like that. So let me dig into this real quick. Is what I think is, if it is Fields, and I don't know that for sure. I think what's holding them up is there really isn't a comparable contract to him. Because Sam Darnold got a 1-year, $10 million deal last year. And then the next highest quarterback was Geno Smith at 24 a year. And I think Fields is somewhere in between, or incentive laden, or 2-year 50, but a lot of that's incentives or something along those lines. He's a hard contract to make right now. Now,
So,
go ahead.
A couple of years ago, we saw Jimmy Garoppolo got a 3-year, $70 million deal from the Raiders. That's probably too much for Fields.
I'd say Garoppolo is more accomplished, though. I don't know if Fields is good.
That's the issue, because I don't think Fields probably deserves a $20 million contract, but I think it's got to be more than $10 million, because $10 million is what high-end backups get.
Right, but that contract doesn't exist right now on the planet, which is weird, which I think is weird. So if I was Fields, maybe I'd want to hold off, and I know the Steelers want to do it soon. But back to fantasy, if Fields is a quarterback for the Steelers, they better invest something in a backup. I mean, you can't just roll with him and Skylar Thompson, because he's never finished a season. I don't know that he's injury prone. I don't really like that way of looking at things, but I would think you have some other reasonable investment, a $5 or $6 million backup, a 2nd round pick. I'm in love with Tyler Shuck, but that's a whole different conversation. But one thing I will tell you that I believe is true is Wilson was really the starter coming out of camp, and really the second he got signed. They can say whatever they wanted, and he wasn't ready while Fields played. So they kept a massive governor on Fields' running, because they didn't want to get to the 3rd quarterback, Allen, in any of those games. So if they sign him, I would assume it's to run like crazy. If not, then don't sign him.
Kate, where do you stand with this?
I think the Steelers are definitely the right fit. I definitely think they need to invest in the backup. And I actually think this is a pretty interesting group of, potential backup quarterbacks. You've got Marcus Mariota hitting free agency. I think he might be a solid backup to Justin Fields as the presumed starter. From a fantasy perspective, though, I do think what we're going to need to see from, Arthur Smith, from Mike Tomlin first, is the commitment to Justin Fields as a starter. A solid contract in place would solidify that. And then I think we need an offseason where they're orchestrating this offense for Justin Fields. I think in general, they were pretty restrictive with the play calling when it was Justin Fields behind center versus Russell Wilson. I think a part of that was just they're very different quarterbacks, and they are good at different things. They're similar in a lot of ways, but because of the age difference, because of Justin Fields' athleticism, you could do a lot more with the designed run game with Justin Fields than you're going to do with Russell Wilson. He's more elusive. So I think with an entire offseason, we're probably going to see some I think we'd see more production in 2025 than we did in 2024 necessarily, because I think they really pulled in the reins as a passer for him. And that lowered, I think, just the overall floor for him in general for fantasy.
Last thing, this would be like Justin Fields' second time in the same offense, like the first time of his career, right? He's just had a lot of turnover with Chicago and then Ohio State and then Georgia. So I do wonder, could you see a massive jump in his play staying with Arthur Smith in year 2? He is somebody that if he were to sign a long-term deal with the Steelers, I would actually be wanting to buy in Dynasty, and I would be pretty aggressive. I think I would pay top 15 prices for Justin Fields. Luckily, you don't have to do that right now. So if you can be, proactive in your trade markets, I would go out and get Fields now before he signs a long-term deal. That is it for today's show. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Check out the channel on YouTube. Download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Follow Matt on Twitter at Williamson NFL. You can follow Kate at Kate Majuk. I'm at Marcus _Mosher, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow.